United we're as strong as a mountain. United
Hey, this is Steve Zeltzer. I'm with noted journalist, writer Chris Hedges, and welcome to the show, Chris.
Thank you.
So, Chris, you have been a foremost critic in the United States against U.S. imperialist policy around the world, and you had a program on RT. Why don't you talk about that and what happened to it, and most recently, the deletion of your tapes?
Right. So I had a television show on Telesur called Days of Revolt. Telesur crashed and burned with the collapse of the Venezuelan economy and the change in governments in countries like Argentina that became right wing and no longer wanted to fund Telesur. And then RT approached me about resurrecting the show, rebranding it, calling it another name, which I agreed to as long as I had editorial control, which I did. They were true to their word. For 6 years, it was primarily a show that interviewed authors. As a writer, I don't like being interviewed by people who don't read the book. I appreciate people who've taken the time to read what I've written. So I was very conscientious about reading the books. I interviewed leading intellectuals, Cornel West, Noam Chomsky, Slavoj Žižek, Wendy Brown, Gerald Horne, and others. And it was a very wonky kind of show that if we had a functioning public broadcasting system would have been on probably very late at night. But of course we don't, because they are as beholden to wealthy donors and corporations as the commercial media. I had been pushed out of the New York Times because of my denunciations of the call to invade Iraq. I'd been the Middle East bureau chief for the New York Times. I spent 7 years in the Middle East. I'm a very public supporter of the boycott, divestment, and sanction movement, which alone will get you blacklisted. It saw my good friend Cornel West denied tenure at Harvard, I think primarily over that issue. So there's fewer and fewer places someone like me can go as a critic of both parties, the corporate control of the Democratic and Republican parties, my critiques of militarism and the surveillance state. And RT gave me that space. Why? Well, because they like to amplify fierce critics of the United States. And of course, we do the same. When I worked in Eastern Europe, I covered the revolution in Czechoslovakia, was in the Magic Lantern Theater every night with Václav Havel, who I knew. And if you wanted to hear Havel, you had to listen to Voice of America. Havel had no more love for the policies of Washington than I had for Moscow. Now, with the invasion of Ukraine, I spoke out again quite publicly against the invasion, calling it, as it was, an act of preemptive war, which under post-Nuremberg laws is a criminal war of aggression. It was precisely that denunciation of our war in Iraq that got me into trouble with the New York Times. But of course, it would be hypocritical to see Russia carry out the same crime and not speak out against it. With this caveat, the invasion of Iraq was based on fabrications and lies. I was in Eastern Europe, as I said, in 1989 as a reporter with the breakup of the Soviet Union. And so I was well aware that Western governments, including the US government, Margaret Thatcher, Hans-Dietrich Genscher, then the foreign minister of Germany, promised Gorbachev that NATO would not be expanded beyond the borders of a unified Germany, a promise that they broke. The Clinton administration promised the Russian government that it would not station NATO troops in Central and Eastern Europe, a promise it broke. We now have, 13 or 14 Eastern and Central European countries integrated into NATO. It never made any geopolitical sense. In fact, in 1989, we all thought NATO was obsolete. It was created as an instrument to prevent Soviet expansion into Central and Eastern Europe. But of course, that wasn't the case. NATO was expanded because it was a multi-billion-dollar a year bonanza for the arms industry. I was in Warsaw not long ago. There were billboards all around the city for Raytheon, because Raytheon is, of course, bilking the Polish people. Poland just signed a $6 billion contract to buy M1 Abrams tanks. And just on the issue of Ukraine, Ukraine is a de facto NATO country, not in name, but in terms of the weaponry, the NATO weaponry that has poured into the Ukraine, along with, I think there were 150 NATO military advisors in the Ukraine before Russia attacked. That's not in any way to excuse what Russia did, but it is to say that they were provoked, and there was uniformity across the political spectrum, whether it was Henry Kissinger or George Kennan or anyone else, that the expansion of NATO was very foolish. In fact, Kennan lived long enough to call it the greatest mistake of the Cold War. But speak in that kind of nuance, engage in that kind of criticism, and there's, of course, very few places you can go. And now they've shut down RT. RT was shut down 6 days after I issued my public denunciation of the war.
And that was the first time I saw you mentioned in the New York Times. They had an article on the shutdown of RT. They mentioned right. Chris Hedges, their former journalist, head right. man, and he gets a mention.
Right, and so 6 days later, RT goes dark, and then I don't know what day it was. I was in London for Julian Assange's wedding. I came back, and a friend of mine texted me to say that the show he was in was no longer on YouTube. So I went on YouTube, and none of the shows, six years, 300 plus shows gone, vanished. Not one of which had anything to do with Russia. In fact, the very few times that Russia was mentioned or Putin was mentioned was in very unflattering terms. Matt Taibbi linked to one of the shows with Alan Narin, where he kind of excoriated Moscow for war crimes in Syria. So we know why they took it off. The 2017 Director of National Intelligence report devoted 7 pages to RT. They were explicit as to what it was they didn't like on RT, and it wasn't Russian propaganda. It was the fact that RT gave a platform to anti-fracking activists, Occupy activists, Black Lives Matter activists, third-party candidates, anti-imperialists. So I think they kind of tipped their hand, and that's why I was disappeared off of YouTube, and that's why RT doesn't exist.
And it seems like in war, the first thing to go is free speech and the right of people to get opponent views out, different views out. And it seems like the stepping up by the corporate tech companies to shut down any dissenting views is an example of their kind of united front to stop any debate or any question of U.S. Policy.
Well, the worst cheerleaders or most enthusiastic for censorship are the Democrats. So they've held hearings in Washington, dragged in the CEOs from these social media companies and demanded more censorship. They engaged in censorship during the last campaign between Biden and Trump. The Twitter locked the New York Post out of its own Twitter account because it had revealed the contents of Hunter Biden's laptop. The rest of the media called it, out of a Russian playbook. The New York Times called it disinformation. It wasn't disinformation. Even the Bidens didn't deny that the contents were real. It was verified information, but it would have potentially hurt the Biden campaign, and so there was a very energetic effort to cover it up or discredit it. You saw Silicon Valley in the last few weeks of the campaign spend hundreds of millions of dollars. We don't know how much because it was dark money, producing negative ads against Trump for the Biden administration. And the quid pro quo, of course, is that the Democrats will not break up these monopolies. So there is a collusion now between the establishment. It's not just the Democratic establishment, because the old Republican establishment has now fused with the Democratic Party. Figures like Liz Cheney, Mitt Romney, Bill Kristol, all these figures in opposition to the kind of cult-like following that has deformed the Republican Party. Now, I don't like these gun-toting militias and Christian fascists and QAnon conspiracy theorists any more than anyone else. But we're not going to, and these are really the products of the assault on the working class. These political distortions grew out of neoliberalism and deindustrialization and trade deals and the slashing of social services, the gutting of welfare and everything else. So we're not going to bring back some kind of political health by banishing their voices. I was on Democracy Now, and oppose removing Trump from the Twitter account, his social media accounts, because if you give these private entities, these opaque entities, about which we know nothing, and of course they know everything about us, that power of wholesale censorship, I knew it wouldn't stop for Trump. With Trump, what I didn't expect is that I would so soon afterwards be a victim myself. But this is a world we really don't want to inhabit.
And there is a growth of a working class movement. The Amazon workers won a tremendous victory in New York. It seems like workers are waking up in the United States, and the need for an alternative media network for yourself and others, where you can have uncensored viewpoints of working class struggle and others who question American imperialism, is absolutely necessary. How do you see that taking place? Because right now, outside of Pacifica, there is no alternative media platform.
Right, that's right, and Pacifica's under a lot of stress. Well, I've gone to Substack like Glenn Greenwald and Matt Taibbi, which is chrishedges.substack.com. If I get enough subscribers, it in essence allows me to continue to write my weekly column, which is on SharePost on Mondays, and reconstitute my television show. And for now, that's about the only model that I've got. I mean, Bob does a magnificent job running SharePost. We didn't have any money. He's kind of trying to make it work out of his Social Security check. So
we're back in the old days.
Yeah. So, well, he never raised much money for Ramparts either. It's not surprisingly. I mean, in fact, there's quite an amusing story of him taking a Pan Am Airlines ad off the back of Time magazine or something and put it on the back of Ramparts, and then taking it around to advertisers to show he was respectable. The result being that Pan Am sued him to take it off. So, yeah, that's, what they do is they push you, the mainstream pushes you out into a marginalized space, and then they demonize that space. That's exactly what happened with me at RT. It's also, by the way, happened to Ramparts, which I forget whether it was Time Magazine or Spiro Agnew or somebody said there was a bomb in every issue. That's what they always do. So I'd love to be on, some early morning show interviewing authors on PBS. Look at the old PBS when it functioned. Back in the 70s, we heard voices, we saw figures: Howard Zinn, Noam Chomsky, James Baldwin, Angela Davis. They were all, Ralph Nader, they were all on PBS. And now, because they have to cater to their donor class and their corporate grants, it's been completely denuded of any real content. I mean, it's and that that gets into the whole collapse of the American media, which has been quite frightening, and something that has kind of happened over my own career. I began as a reporter in the 1980s in Central America, and Cy Hirsch, who's probably our greatest investigative journalist, exposed the massacre of 500 unarmed civilians at My Lai by the U.S. Army, exposed Abu Ghraib. He can't publish in the United States. And I had a wonderful interview with him about his memoir, Reporter, and I direct you all to watch it on YouTube, except it's been erased.
And Julian Assange, of course, they're trying to get him back here because WikiLeaks actually exposed American crimes in Iraq and unprosecuted. So the punishment is
sure. I mean, you rip back a veil on the inner workings of power the way Julian did or Edward Snowden did, and look where they are now. It's pretty, I mean, and then listening to the crocodile tears of the ruling elites about Putin's assault on the press, which I'm not defending. I mean, it has been pretty egregious. Meanwhile, they're torturing Julian Assange to death in Belmarsh prison. And this is someone who never committed a crime. He published this material. He didn't even leak it. He didn't, like Daniel Ellsberg. The hypocrisy is pretty rank. But then that gets into what Ed Herman and Noam Chomsky in Manufacturing Consent pointed out, that there's always worthy and unworthy victims. So Ukrainians, and I don't think it's accidental that they're white, are worthy, and Yemenis who for 7 years have, in the words of the UN, endured the world's worst humanitarian disaster, 240,000 dead, malnutrition and starvation, cholera epidemics, all with weapons that we have sold to Saudi Arabia. In fact, of course, we know because of WikiLeaks revelations that we've been quite active in targeting sites in Yemen. Palestinians are unworthy victims. So, and that hypocrisy is going to get us nowhere. We either live under a rule of law where that law applies to everyone, or we go into this kind of Hobbesian nightmare. So, okay, you want to haul Putin off to The Hague, be my guest, but you better make sure George W. Bush is in the cell next to him, because however egregious the war crimes are in the Ukraine, they pale beside the war crimes that we committed for 20 years in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, and everywhere else.
Vietnam, millions of people died as a result
sure.
of U.S. crimes.
I mean, Vietnam was one long atrocity. Nick Turse did a good book on it, Kill Anything That Moves, based on Army records, which they've now sealed up again because they realized they shouldn't have made them public. Sure.
And you may be coming out to Google to do them a visit with other people. So I think this has to be a national campaign of journalists, of writers, of working people, the right to hear voices and not being suppressed. So I want to thank you very much for joining us, Chris, and hopefully we can force Google to put your videotapes back on their platform at YouTube.
Great. Thanks, Steve.